Yeah. So one question I have just about the idea of having contractors cover volunteers in the summertime, like that. Going from a volunteer who, let's just say, doesn't cost anything versus a contractor which does. What is that conversation like with church leadership to say, hey, we can't cover this weekend with volunteers and we need to spend some money? Yeah, it feels like budget is always a concern. And so has that been a hard conversation, or, yeah, I'd just be curious, how do you handle that leading up part of the contractor question?
So, probably two sides of this story. Again, going back to the church I was at prior to COVID, we kind of had this sort of wave of how we handled things where, I'm going to rely a lot on what the pastor's vision is for what
Yep.
we're trying to accomplish. And so if he's like, hey, I want paid contractors, I want the highest possible quality level we can get out of this thing, then that's what we're going to do.
Sure.
Or, hey, we want volunteers, we want to build up this volunteer culture, then again, that's the direction we're going to swing in.
Yeah.
So the church that I was at pre-COVID, we kind of just, we would swing back and forth. And I knew where the pastor's vision was, but budget dictated most
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we kind of go into this season where we'd be like, all right, all paid contractors for audio. And so we'd reach out to the people that we knew, we'd bring in the contractors, they would fill in those roles. And then, as the fiscal year would go on, the budgets would get tighter and it'd be like, hey, I know we said this, but we need you to train up some volunteers now, move volunteers back into those spaces. And so we'd kind of go in those waves. And so for that church in that time, the need really wasn't a hard thing for us to push because,
Okay.
again, most of the time it seemed like pastor was kind of driving that conversation.
Sure. Okay.
When we were in those tight budget seasons, though, those would become a little bit more difficult conversations because we'd say, hey, we need somebody to come fill this. All of our volunteers are out. And so those would become a little bit more harder conversations. But again, pastor always kind of had that understanding because his desire was to have those contractors in
Sure.
those roles anyways. And so while it might be do we really have to? Is there any way? At the end of the day, it was always, all right. But again, when we're in those seasons of volunteers, like, hey, we're going to get back to those volunteer roles.
Sure. Right.
I think here at Trinity, it's a pretty similar situation.
Yeah.
I think our pastoral staff has an understanding of where we are as a team, not just the staff members, but as well as our volunteers. And so when we just hit that point of, we're at our highest capacity, when we just can't go any further, we're down volunteers, we kind of already have, I think, built into our budget as well, money for contracting too.
Got it.
So again, it makes that conversation a little bit easier.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And again, even thinking further back, I just can't think of too many times where we've had with any of the churches or pastors that I've worked with where it was twist somebody's arm behind their backs.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I think if I went to them and I'm like, hey, let's contract everything out,
Yeah. Yeah.
then we'd probably have an awkward conversation.
Sure, yeah.
But for the most part, I think, again, as long as those lines of communication are open and everybody kind of understands where we're at, it usually doesn't seem to be a hard pull.
Sure.
for
Yeah.